Welcome everyone to the Field Advisor webinar here on November 18th, 2025. Today's webinar is titled Soil Health Sounds Great, but Is It Paying Yet? Welcome everyone. My name is Kelsey Litchfield. I'm the Agronomy Outreach Manager for Illinois Soybean Association and also editor of Field Advisor. Welcome to today's webinar. We appreciate you being here and taking time out of your schedule. I welcome today's presenters, Dr. Andrew Margenot and Heidi Allen Asensio with the University of Illinois. I'll do some introductions for them here in a bit. But real quick, before I start, I'm also being assisted today by Lauren Hill, who's our agronomy outreach specialist at Illinois Soybean Association. So I appreciate her help. And also, I want to tell you real quick about Field Advisor. If you are not familiar with the Field Advisor platform, it is a agronomy content media platform that is funded by the Illinois Soybean Checkoff. So we provide the latest agronomic information and on-farm research from experts across Illinois and the Midwest to help Illinois soybean producers improve yield and profitability. We have a blog, we have webinars, we have a podcast you can subscribe to, videos, and events for those interested in agronomy and crop production. So if you're interested in learning more about Field Advisor, you can go to fieldadvisor.org. Real quick, some housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded and will be available after the live session on Field Advisor's YouTube channel. So give us just some time to be able to edit it and post it, hopefully by the end of the day today or tomorrow, and you can refer back to that as well. One CEU credit in soil and water management will be available. And if you're watching the webinar live, a QR code will be available at the end of this. And if you're watching the recording of this webinar, we recommend self-reporting for the CEU credit. So you can email us at fieldadvisor@illsoy.org for assistance with that. Questions are welcomed. I will say we received over 30 questions from the registration form, and I have passed those along to Andrew and Heidi. Some really great questions, and I know we probably won't get through all of them today, but we've already been talking about a part two in the future for this webinar. So if your question doesn't get addressed today, we hope to do it eventually, but you're also welcome to submit questions through the Q&A section during the webinar too. Okay, real quick, let's meet our panelists. Dr. Andrew Margenot is a soil scientist and associate professor at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He joined the Illinois agricultural community in 2017 and leads a research team of more than 40 members that evaluates nutrient. Oh, Dr. Margenot, I cannot. How do you pronounce biochemistry? Or how do you pronounce
Biogeochemistry.
biogeochemistry? Thank you. In Illinois and the greater north central U.S. region. Margenot's research focuses on phosphorus management, soil health, and carbon crediting with the goal of supporting efficient nutrient use for crop productivity that also supports environmental quality. Welcome. Then I'll also introduce Heidi Allen Asensio. She's a doctoral student in the Department of Crop Sciences at the University of Illinois. She joined Dr. Margenot's lab in 2021. Her research seeks to establish and integrate benchmarks of soybean sustainability in Illinois using soil health, water quality, and climate smart metrics. She is passionate about working collaboratively with farmers, understanding local agricultural practices, and ultimately generating knowledge to inform decision making. So I will now turn it over to them. Lauren, you can stop sharing and we'll hand it over for their presentation. Thank you.
Okay.
Looks good.
Alrighty. Very good. So, first of all, big thanks to ISA for having Haiti and myself here today. We were pretty eager to get this going, and we realized it's probably good to stop till harvest was done. So, this is coming to you with a lot of thoughts that initiated in the summer, looking at the past season's data. So, we plan to share with you about 2 years worth of data of this 4-year project. As you've heard, the focus of today's webinar is on soil health and whether it's paying yet. And I want us to think about paying in a couple of ways. One, as you'll hear from Haiti, is the literal, or let's say the dollar ROI. So what's the net profitability of conservation practices that we know translate to soil health eventually? The focus of today is really on in the early stage following adoption, do we see a positive ROI? And as we'll talk about later, there's reasons to think that eventually we achieve that. We're focused here on the short term. So that's one sense of whether soul health does it pay. The other sense of that phrase is philosophically whether it pays to test for soil health. And I've got some thoughts prepared to share with the group on there's reasons to want to soil health test and reasons maybe to hold back on it. And the data from these experiments that you'll hear about offer some guidance on when it does and doesn't make sense to test by different metrics of soil health. So with that, let me get into the design of this study. So this is part of a larger project that is over 4 years. It's called the Benchmarking Project, where we're looking at interrelated outcomes of cropping systems focused on soybean, but also, well, it's in rotation with corn, and in a few of our study sites, we have it as double cropping. We want to understand everything at once. A lot of studies look at one of these four aspects. That's fine. We want to understand in order to be able to juggle all of them together, what are the simultaneous trade-offs, if any, between soil health, carbon credits, yields, profitability, and water quality? So what you're hearing about today is just one of four different thrusts or focuses of this project. To achieve this, we've got three sites across the state shown here, up in Monmouth, in East Central on campus, and down south in Franklin County. And these are the folks that make this happen. There's a large team of researchers and collaborators to whom we are grateful. As you'll see here, we are testing a combination of four practices in the blue box. This is a full factorial of cover cropping with cereal rye, with chisel or no tillage. So we have four combinations that result from yes, no for each of those two conservation practices. And in the southernmost two sites, so Urbana and down at Ewing in Franklin County, we have a second rotation, so not just corn soybean, but corn, double crop, wheat, soybean. And what's also important is that at all sites, for all conservation treatments in replicate, we also have each phase present. So we've got the corn of the corn soybean, the soybean of the corn soybean, etc. This is important because we can disentangle a phase effect from the weather that year. So overall, 200 plots across the state that we measure in some cases weekly for things like greenhouse gases, and as you'll hear about today for soil health every 6 months. So fall sampling after harvest, and then spring before planting. Okay, there's a lot that could be said here and that has been said. So for more background on soybeans and soil health specifically, we have discussed this at length, and I would refer you to this webinar from about, let's say, a year and a half ago. And so in this webinar, which is online, we go into detail on the reciprocity. How does soil health impact soybeans, and how do soybeans impact soil health? So the focus for today is the halfway mark of this project. After one full crop rotation, so 2 seasons in, what are we seeing when it comes to soil health? And we've got four questions. First is, can we detect 2 years in a change in soil health as assessed by different tests, also called indicators? Second, what does it do for yield? How much yield do we make under these different conservation practices? Third, does that pay? Meaning, what's the net return to those practices? And the fourth question is, how do these things vary? If we're up in Monmouth on really rich black prairie soils versus down south on thinner timber soils, is there contextuality? And we would expect that yes. So the question is not so much do we expect it, but how much? This is a how much question. And again, this is all in the framework of replicated 2 by 2. So with and without cover cropping, with and without no tillage, or let's say chisel versus no till. A good question was asked amongst those 30 questions that Kelsey mentioned that were sent in. And this is that question up here on the blue box. And the question is basically saying, Andrew, isn't this a little silly? 2 years in, we all know soil health, especially conservation practice driven soil health outcomes. take time. This is a medium to long game, not a short game. And that's absolutely correct. I agree with that. The question for the research here is when can we expect or anticipate to begin to see those changes? So we well know from what's been published out there from farmers' experiences that within 6, 8, certainly 10 years of going to no-till to cover cropping, it's very likely to elicit a soil health change. Our question is, can we catch that within 2 versus 3 versus 4 years? This is the early stage of adoption where lots of initial adopters might get turned off. They might get burned on a yield drag. They may have questions on how to optimize the system. And that entry point is precisely the focus of this project. So especially for our for our more high clay soils, we've got silty clay loams, and as a result, typically more organic matter, OM. It will take more time than usual. If we're on coarse textures like sands up in Michigan, within 2 years, there's almost always an effect of these practices. So for our context, yes, this will likely take more time. And one one way to think about this is that there are breakpoints. There's a point at which we will shift the metabolism, so to speak, of the system. And we know this to be the case for other sites. Here's a nice example showing the gross expenditures and income and thus the net in blue here, following the adoption of no tillage compared to chisel till up in Michigan. And the point is that there are crossovers. There are thresholds in soil health indicators when they begin to respond to a practice in yields and in profitability. And these might occur at different time scales. So this is then why we're focusing on a 4-year window. What you're about to hear is the halfway point. So 2 years in, one full rotation into these practices. Let's talk a bit about indicators. This is the term that's often used in the science and on the NRCS side of things when referring to the tests that we're doing. So really, soil health tests can be thought of specific indicators. And soil health itself is not new if we realize that lots of the chemical and physical soil health indicators are the same thing that we've been measuring for upwards of 50, even 70 years. So, for example, chemical indicators are things like melic P or pH. What is new then about soil health really is the biological circle. It's the biological health indicators that are fairly new. And not new, as we'll see for respiration, in the sense of they've not been unheard of, but rather how we begin to analyze them with respect to outcomes of interest in response to practices. So for this work, we are looking at USDA, NRCS, certified or let's say recommended indicators that are also being analyzed and offered by many private sector labs. And the ones that we are focusing on for this work, first one is this active carbon test. Asterisk here because as we have shown, it's not active and it's not carbon. It certainly says something. So I believe that we can say that a test is wrong, like POC. It is not carbon, it's not active. But even though it's wrong in terms of what we think it is, there's still value. The data that we see on POC does indicate that it is telling us something about how the soil metabolism is shifting in response to conservation practices. So there's a bit of nuance here. We also look at the enzymes in soils to keep on that metaphor of metabolism of soils. These are the enzymes that digest organic matter and liberate specific nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus for crop use. We also look at aggregate stability. In my opinion, this is the great integrator because you need really physical, chemical, and biological. And as a side note, there is somewhat of an awkwardness in trying to categorize these as simply biological, simply physical, etc. Aggregates are a fine example of really all three of those. It's the triumvirate of chemistry, biology, and physics. We also look at the keystone indicator. It holds it all together of total organic carbon, which is really a high accuracy estimate of organic matter content. They tell us the same thing. And finally, what we'll focus on for today, respiration, which goes by many other names that we will go over shortly. So, Respiration is CO2 release. We will focus on this for today's webinar simply because, well, it responded the most of all the other tests. So there already is one takeaway is that of all these, the most responsive was respiration. In some cases, there was no response for some of these in the first 2 years. CO2 release is really what we are measuring when we say respiration. Just like we are respiring, we're exhaling CO2. Well, same thing goes for soils. This is arguably the oldest measurement that is today a recognized soil health indicator, i.e. test. And when I say oldest, I'm talking over 100 years ago. Here are just a couple papers from 1919 and again from 1923, that is, that are um, that are giving a nod towards the value of measuring the CO2 evolved or respired from soils. So the 1919 paper by Agani is thinking about the co-liberation of nutrients like nitrate. And the 23 paper by Waxman is looking at how well can we use CO2 evolution, meaning respiration, it is evolving out of a soil sample as an index of soil fertility. So this idea that the amount of CO2 that is released by a soil sample is not new. What has changed is that we're a lot better in terms of how precise and how accurate we are in measuring CO2. And then how we're also accompanying that measurement with other indicators that collectively might tell us something. Now, what I want to point out is that most soil health testing that uses CO2 or respiration is using a 24-hour duration. But as you might imagine, soils are respiring for well beyond that. We just have a cutoff. It's arbitrary. Really, it's just convenient for testing labs to do this of 24 hours. So here are two examples of soils that we did the respiration test for, but for 28 days, so 4 weeks. These are from the Morrow plot. So these are year 145, corn on corn since 1876. And if we were to just measure this in the convention of soil health testing, it would be this very narrow window. And note that the amount of CO2 actually peaks about 4 days in. That would be at least for the corn on corn with nothing ever added, or about 3 days in for the corn on corn with NPK plus lime. So just be aware that we choose 24 hours. There's no magic reason for that. Simply then, people want to go home after a workday in the commercial lab, and 24 hours syncs up nicely. That's it. Some folks also offer 6 or 12-hour tests. Some offer 48 hours. So the key there is consistency. What we're really measuring is microbial waste from both ends of the organism, so to speak. And this is natural process. When they are metabolizing organic carbon in the soil, they are burning it up just like we are, just like you're exhaling CO2 from last night's dinner. Same thing for the CO2 of the microbes. The way that we standardize this test today is that we first dry the soil, then we re-wet it, and then we measure the CO2 that is released upon wetting over 24 hours. We're measuring this as a ppm, part per million, specifically the amount of carbon as CO2, milligrams per kilogram of soil. So pound per acre in terms of fertility, like P, you would multiply ppm times 2 to get pound per acre. So if you wanted to think about how many pounds of carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, CO2, are being respired, you would take this test number in ppm and multiply by 2 to get pounds per acre. Not that it's really that meaningful, unlike melic P or melic K, but still, that's the conversion. So some pros about the respiration test. It's simple, relatively cheap. We know what we're measuring. It's CO2 from the metabolism of these microbes. It's related to other nutrients in organic matter as they mineralize. So there's reason to think that this might be relevant to nitrogen release from organic matter. The reality is that it's a little bit loose, but hey, it's there. And it can be highly sensitive. So these are all great pros of any soil health tests. There's also cons, like it's not fully standardized. Some folks run it for 6 hours or 12 hours, how much soil mass they use, how wet it is. As a result, it varies tremendously from lab to lab, even within the same lab. It's unclear when we get down to brass tacks what this means for nutrients. Can we cut back 20 units of nitrogen per acre based upon the test being higher? We're not really there yet. It varies by season, as we'll show you shortly, and it's also very sensitive. That's both a pro and a con. This test is also known by many other names. So respiration, the 24-hour respiration test, CO2 burst, the Solvita test. These are all getting at the same principle, which is how much CO2 is released by a soil. How you quantify that, the extent, and how you re-wet it. These are all the nuances that are part of the cons of it not being standardized. But the principle for all these is the same. Okay, so I will jump right into our results. This is again showing you 2 years in, so this is fall 2024 testing of the respiration results across our three sites of Monmouth, Urbana, and Ewing down south. And the first thing to note is that we see no effect at Urbana or at Monmouth, our higher SOM prairie soils. We see no effect of the conservation practices on respiration. So after 2 years of no-till compared to chisel, with or without cover cropping, there is no difference. We also see no difference in the phase or the rotation. So, for example, as you can see here, the highlighted letter would be the phase of determination within that rotation. So, on the very bottom left, we've got the corn phase of corn soybean. If we look at the soybean phase, third from the right, that's in highlight, that's the soybean phase of the same 2 year corn soybean crop rotation. So we see no differences in respiration by anything in what we do at the prairie soil sites. It doesn't matter how we rotate, what phase we sample in, when we sample, spring or fall, which, by the way, may be a good thing strategically or practically. And surprisingly to us, there's no difference in whether or not you cover crop, whether or not that's in conjunction with no tillage or chisel tillage. One explanation here is that we already have a pretty good amount of labile organic matter, and so we may not be registering any change within the first 2 years on this measurement of respiration, how much carbon can be mineralized readily by the microbes. For Ewing, things changed. So this is our southernmost site. It's in the less recently glaciated region of the states. So we're talking here timber soils, as some call them. These are lower organic matter by a factor of 2 compared to the previous sites that you just saw. First thing to notice is that the respiration values as a function of timing. So pinkish red would be the fall sampling. The spring sampling of that year would be in the teal. There's a difference in when we sample, and there's also just differences among the rotation in the phase. Again, though, we did not see any effect of tillage or cover cropping treatments on respiration. So, how you rotate crops and what phase you sample in when matters on the timber soil sites. And I think the same explanation of why we don't see any differences in the higher organic matter prairie sites explains these responses, which is we have in this case less organic matter to start with. And so the small differences induced by, in this case, phases and crop rotations does register as a difference in respiration values. So what we can see here is that there are differences between the timing of sampling first and foremost. And basically, spring sampling of soils led to higher values than fall sampling. And this was and this was true across all of the phases in crop rotations. Lots of reasons to think about why this might be. I think one that could be is that well, there's warming soils, the microbes are more active. That's a potential explanation. But one thing that we don't know is how much this would vary if we were to sample, say, every month for 12 months of the year. And I think that would be a good next step in general for the research world to consider to better dial in these times of sampling. When it comes to the differences that we see among phases and rotations, the largest ones that are accentuated are between the corn phase, as we can see here, second from right, where my cursor is. When we're talking about spring sampling, the corn phase of the corn double cropping system, so wheat, soybean, relative to a simple soybean corn rotation sampled in the soybean phase. That's the largest difference in respiration. Now, overall, these values are not large in absolute differences. So the ppm of respiration values isn't super large. We're talking in the order of 10, 20 maximum for the range. And between these treatments, maybe about 10 ppm. This brings us to the question, what is a good value for my respiration test, my Solvita test? And this is an example on the right-hand side of a non-objective interpretation chart. Non-objective because this is not based on any data. This is based on a suggested template. And some thoughts here that I would offer up to the audience. We have not yet calibrated respiration values to outcomes of interest. Now, those outcomes of interest that they are many and they can vary. So to me, one would be yield. Another could be the ability to pull back on units of N or P and K. Yield stability in droughtier years might be a different one. Whichever outcome or outcomes of interest, though, there is no link empirically based on data with these values being thought to be low or high. Compare that with, say, the Mellick test, where a low value means a higher risk of yield loss if we don't apply P. We're not there yet with these tests. Now, in terms of where our sites rank in terms of the ppm, at Urbana that we just saw earlier on, and Ewing is about the same, honestly. We're averaging about 45 ppm. It differs from 37 to 52, but this is all within the range of what this chart would consider to be slightly below to slightly above average. So to put it differently, across all of our sites in Illinois, regardless of these treatments of tillage and cover cropping, etc., the respiration values that we see are just basically average. They're averaging out to average, right? Just above and just below. Again, I personally don't take much stock in that ranking column. It's arbitrary. It's not really based on evidence. Ultimately, what we think is a good or high value needs calibration. And second, it's going to vary by texture, especially in total organic matter. And what the evidence is suggesting is that within a given texture range and organic matter range, then the differences can begin to be meaningful. Now, for some context, I thought that I would share data from a different experiment. It's on the same exact soil type as the site in Urbana that you've just seen. It's the Flanagan Soil Series. This study began in 1876. It's the Morrow plots. And we conducted in the year 145 in 2021 the respiration tests in the same exact manner that you just saw presented for these ISA sites. And we did it at two depths just to see what would change. And for context, plotted here would be the ISA Urbana site average of 45 ppm for respiration, which again is about the average for all of our sites, including Ewing. So the Mara plots are not that different. This is all consistent. The difference here is that we've been going for 145 years of crop rotation at the time of this data being produced. And we see that as we increase the crop rotation from continuous corn to a three-way, we see that there is an uptick in values. Statistically, they're not significant because of high variability in the values. And we see that as we go from adding nothing to NPK to manure, we in general get a higher respiration value. But ultimately, crop rotation leads to higher average values than the fertility treatments at the Mara plots after 145 years. Why did I bring this up? Well, we were talking at the beginning of this about long versus short game. This is a long game. This is actually the second longest game, experimentally speaking, in the world, the Morrow plots. And we don't really see respiration reflecting crop rotations. Now, we don't have tillage or cover cropping treatments here, but this might give us pause that in our prairie soils, respiration may not be the best metric. Do I think that rotation, no tillage offer benefits to soil health? Absolutely. I'm just pointing out that the data suggests respiration may not be the best way to capture what we think is happening. So, if we think about the relationship of respiration and soil organic matter measured as soil organic carbon shown here, using the Morrow plot data, if we just correlate these, roughly 43% of the respiration values can be explained by total organic matter. That's a decent correlation, and it would suggest that in general, if we increase our OM values, we're going to increase the respiration. But there's still roughly two-thirds, or let's say 60% of the respiration values that are not simply chalked up to the total OM content. And that's valuable because it means that we're not just measuring organic matter by a different name. and perhaps more expensively. There is something unique here about respiration. Okay, so that brings us finally to this point before we talk about yields and ROI led by Heidi on whether respiration is worth it. Is it worth measuring? So in general, respiration is going to be at least twice as expensive as your standard commercial fertility tests, pH, CEC, OM by LOI, your MELIC, PK, etc. And if we just do a quick survey of commercial tests out there from public land grants like Colorado State in the bottom right to private labs for the other options, if we do some math, we see that these tests can range from as high as 40 to as low as $17 each, roughly speaking. And from other tests that I've seen, this is about ballpark. So we're talking typically upwards of 20 if it's lab grade. If it's a field test like the one in the top right, those are cheaper, but they're a lot looser. We're talking accuracies of 5 or 10 ppm units, not single digit ppm precision. So this brings us then to a greater question that we have to address. And this is where the does it pay has a philosophical connotation for soul health. Do we need to be testing for a practice that we know is good? And this gets dangerous, right? Because we also want some evidence, this is what testing is, to guide practices. We don't want to just make assumptions. Though I think we all agree that no tillage and cover cropping certainly confer benefits for soil health. That's why I say yes and no here. And there's, I think, four ways that we should think about soil health testing that makes a marked departure from traditional soil fertility testing. So the first one that might be most important that I've already hinted at is that soil health testing is not yet calibrated to an outcome of interest. And let's take, for example, soil P testing. This is data from Iowa State. And we know, for example, that if we're considering in this example on the y-axis soybean yields, the increase on the y-axis bushel per acre, that by calibrating the soil test response to the yield response, we can come up with some fairly good quantitative recommendations. This is brass tacks. We know that we can expect to lose out on bushels if we have our soil test get under 26 ppm in this example by MELIC. And if we translate this to ROI on the y-axis, this is now dollar per acre return. And depending on the price of soybeans, this is from 2000, so forgive this high price. Same with the DAP cost here. And if we change things like the price of grain, then we see that the critical value of the p-test is dynamic, which is in today's economy a good lesson. These are not gold standard values, they're very flexible. So the point here is that whether it's bushel per acre or net return per acre, soil tests for fertility, despite their shortcomings, which I'm well aware of, they do give us some quantitative guidance. We do not have this for soil health tests. And I'd like to see if someone has evidence to the contrary, please let me know because I've yet to see one that is this kind of rigor. This is where we should go, I think, for soil health testing. So that's one way that this is quite unique. Second is we've got lower confidence in what we're actually measuring. And a good and hand in hand with this is that we have sometimes more variability across labs and thus variability in the results. So two and three are more surmountable, I think. This is about getting the basic research and the labs on board. Here's an example of active carbon that I've mentioned, where we have shown in a few publications now that it is not carbon that we're measuring. So we have zero confidence scientifically in what active carbon is. It's not even carbon that we're measuring. Is it telling us something about soil health? Absolutely, but it's not really as higher confidence as respiration. And we've also shown with our USDA colleagues in a series of other papers like this one, and this one, that you cannot rely on the epoxy or the active carbon values from any commercial lab because just how you look at the soil, not really, but it's about that sensitive, how you handle the soil, how you grind it will completely change the value. So these are issues that we have ironed out in fertility testing that we have yet to iron out in soil health testing. And the fourth consideration is that one metric is probably unlikely, probably insufficient to capture the thing of interest. So if soil health refers to metabolism of the soil that helps us cut back on inputs or disease suppression, pick your poison here, then we're probably going to need a basket of different analyses. And which ones we pick, how we integrate those, that remains still outstanding. To go back to my own preferred way to think about soil health, which is soil metabolism, any metabolic assessment will require a metabolic panel, as we do for humans. And there's a lot of complex biochemistry here that I think, excitingly, we have yet to dive into, but we need to actually get into to make soil health more quantitative for the end user. Okay, so the last thought here before Heidi shares with you yields and the ROI, let's talk about the ROI and soil health tests to help frame the numbers that she will be showing you. This is the final consideration for do we need to test for a practice like no tillage or cover cropping that we know is giving us benefits. And the risk here, as we've just seen, is that with all those uncertainties and variability across labs, what we're actually measuring, etc., there's also just a high expense of soil health testing. If we're doing 5 acre grid sampling based upon the respiration tests costs, we're talking $3.40 to $8 per acre. And if we're doing finer scale grid testing at 2 acre grid, which is oftentimes the recommendation for soil health evaluations, we're talking up to $20 per acre. Especially in today's market, that's a pretty high cost. But even apart from that, if we had $16 bushel soybean, is it really worth spending 20 bucks per acre to evaluate respiration if it cannot tell you exactly how many units of N to cut back on or whether or not there's another fungicide application or pre-application needed? And that's where I think these tests need to go. And I think that we can get there with research that's going on in the state. I have three propositions for the end user here, be it farmer, crop consultant, etc. Really, they stem around this question. How would you change a practice based on results? I get and I agree with it's interesting to see the number. What does the Haney value look like? What is the respiration test? And I'm not dismissing that. That's important. But to justify the costs, how would you change a test? What's your number? If that number goes up or down above a certain amount, would you stop or would you keep going on a given practice? So knowing what your number is might be useful here. And what's your direction? Is it going up or down? And if it goes down, how much confidence in the test do you need to say that that's a real change? This gets down into the final question, which is, do you understand your system's variability sufficiently to tell apart whether that's just noise or a real signal? And this is where repeated sampling, higher grid sampling is useful, but also bears a high cost, which I think spits us back up to number one, which is it worth testing if we think it's giving us benefits? This is why calibrating to outcomes is going to be useful. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Haiti. She'll walk you through the yields and the economic ROI on these same exact systems.
Thank you, Andrew. I just sent a share request for my screen and I will begin sharing right now. Does this show a blank screen, Andrew?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. We will start. So for the second half of this webinar, I will be, if this allows me to move forward, give me a minute. There we go. For the second half of this webinar, I will be sharing some exciting preliminary results of the soybean yield response to the adoption of conservation practices across the soil climate gradient of Illinois. We will discuss the impact of no-till and cereal rye, not only on soybean yield, but also on economic return. This is a visual representation of our soil conservation practices in a corn-soybean rotation. We are testing cover crops as cereal rye versus none, and tillage as till versus no-till. As Andrew previously explained, this is just a refresher. On the screen, we can see our rotation, which started on corn on 2023, followed by soybean on 2024. For our cover crop treatment, we planted cereal rye before the corn and before soybean. For our tillage treatments, we have primary tillage in the fall and secondary in the spring. And for our no-till treatments, we have absolutely no tillage operations throughout the year. These results in a total of 4 treatment combinations, which Andrew already explained, but you can see it at the bottom of the slide. We will begin with our site in northwestern Illinois, located at Monmouth, where we have a molly soil with silt loam texture and silty clay loam texture, with an average of 4.5% soil organic matter and a pH of 6.1. Our results showed that till plots with cereal rye had a 2% yield increase relative to till plots without cereal rye, while no-till plots with cereal rye had a 6.1% yield decrease relative to no-till plots without cereal rye. So, at our northwestern location, cereal rye had a positive impact on soybean yield in tilled plots. In the case of tillage practices, in plots without cereal rye, no-till had a 9.5% decrease relative to tilled plots. Similarly, in plots with cover crop, in this case cereal rye, no-till had a 17% decrease relative to tilled plots. This made us reach the conclusion that at our northwestern site, no-till did not have a positive impact on soybean yield in plots with or without cereal rye as a cover crop. When we analyzed our yields by the 4 treatment combinations, we found that cover crop plus still had the greatest soybean yield. Additionally, our results show that tillage maximized yields as evidenced by this 10.5% increase when we go from the no-till treatments to the till treatments. We think that the large volume of corn residue from the left in the soil surface by no-till might slow down soil warming during the spring and also immobilize N in the early vegetative stages of soybean. The N immobilization by corn residue decomposition could affect N availability for the early stages of soybean. Work done in Iowa has shown that soybean biological nitrogen fixation, is 2 times more during the reproductive stages than during the vegetative stages. This means that soil nitrogen supply is important for early soybean growth. Regarding the economic return of these soil conservation practices, our results showed that the greater yields with tillage not only translated into greater productivity, but also resulted in greater economic return. But, spoiler alert, this was not always the case at our other sites. As a small side note, in the corner of the slide, you can find the source of our estimated costs, basically coming from FarmDoc published documents. Now, we will talk about our results in the site located in East Central Illinois at Champaign County on campus, where we also have a molly soil with silty clay loam texture, an average organic matter content of 4.8%, and a pH of 6.5. Our results showed that till plots with cereal rye had a 1% decrease relative to till plots without cereal rye. Similarly, we had a 4% decrease in no-till plots with cereal rye relative to no cereal rye. At our East Central site, we did not observe a positive impact of cereal rye on yield, regardless of tillage practice. Now, for our tillage practices, in plots without cereal rye, no-till had a 4% decrease and a 7% decrease in plots with cereal rye. Our results at East Central Illinois did not show a positive impact of no-till on soybean yield with or without cereal rye as a cover crop. When we compare soybean yields by treatment combination, we found the greatest yield in no cover crop plus till treatment. We also found that tillage maximizes yield, but not as much when compared to our northwestern site. We relate this back to our hypothesis of the influence of corn residue left by the previous corn before the soybean. Well, we had corn yields greater than 250 bushels in the northwest side and a 10% yield increase with tillage. At the east central site, we had a slightly lower corn yields of 200 bushels in average and a smaller percent greater yield when tillage was implemented, as shown here by this 3.2% increase when we moved from the no-till to the till treatments. When we look at the economic return by treatments, we found that despite having the second lowest soybean yield, the no cover crop no-till resulted in the greatest economical return by reducing costs. This is also related to the smaller yield differences between tilled and no-till treatments. As you can recall, we had a 10% estimated increase at the northwestern site when we switched from no-till to till, and a 3.2 at the east central location. So that's how we relate that we had a smaller difference between these two conservation practices. And finally, we will discuss our results from the site in southern Illinois, where we have a different edaphic condition, with the purpose of generating results tailored to the diverse soybean production systems of the state. At our southernmost location, we have an alphisol with a silt loam texture and an average 2.8% soil organic matter content. The pH of this soil is 7. We observed that in till plots, cereal rye had a 1% increase relative to till plots without the cereal rye. In the case of no-till plots, we observed a 6% yield decrease with cereal rye relative to no cereal rye. We concluded that at our site in southern Illinois, cereal rye had a positive impact on soybean yield in till plots. Now, regarding tillage practices, our results show a 9% increase in yield on no-till relative to till without cereal rye, and a 1% increase with no-till with cereal rye relative to till. Unlike at our other two sites, no-till had a positive impact on soybean yield in plots with and without cereal rye as a cover crop. When we order the treatment combinations by yield, we see that our soybean yields were maximized by no-till. This can be related to the different landscape in southern Illinois compared to northern and central Illinois, with rolling hills that are more susceptible to soil erosion. Additionally, we hypothesized that greater moisture retention by no-till could be related to the positive impacts that we saw reflected on yield. When we examined the economic return by treatment in southern Illinois, we found that the reduction of production costs with no-till and no cover crop translated into increased profitability. So, what can we conclude from the soybean yields of our 2024 season at our experimental sites? Firstly, for northwestern Illinois, cereal rye in till systems resulted in a small soybean yield improvement, and greater soybean yield in till plots generated higher economical returns. In east central Illinois, tillage maximized soybean yield with or without cereal rye, but to a lower degree than in northwestern Illinois. However, the reduced costs resulted in greater economic returns from no-till without cereal rye. At our southern location, No-till maximize soybean yields and economic returns with or without cereal rye present. I would like to end my part of the webinar with some additional considerations to contextualize a little bit our findings. And this is, we need to take into consideration that these are soybean yield results after 2 years. And as Andrew previously mentioned, the benefits of conservation practices can manifest after long-term adoption. And also this is a snapshot of the 2024 season. So stay tuned for future webinars where we are going to talk about trends and if we can see these trends holding throughout the 4 years of the experiment. And finally, I would also like to bring to your attention that to relieve short-term impacts of conservation practice adoption, there are cost share programs or other financial incentive programs that could be an option. And with that, I will end my sharing of the screen and return it to Andrew.
Thank you.
Thanks, Heidi. Alrighty, so I think that was a nice overview of the yield and the net returns on these practices. So let's bring it back to soil health and the opening and the motivating question of today, which was, does it pay? And I want to hear go over some of the key takeaways in the soil health end of things based upon what you've just heard. So the first thing that strikes me is that there are, in some cases like down south, a clear yield and economic advantage to a conservation practice like no-till. Cover crop seems a bit more mixed, especially up in the northern sites. Now, if we think about soil health response, we saw no effect of tillage or cover cropping on respiration, and for the other soil health tests for that matter, things like enzymes, things like active carbon. So that to me might indicate that the bank account, the net ROI, seems more responsive to these practices than the soil health measurements that we're making. That I think is a key takeaway here. That's we need to be careful because some things might be short term more profitable, but we're mining soils. But it is striking to me that soil health testing, especially given the cost of respiration, isn't telling us what the system is telling us in terms of higher yields with no tillage down south, but also lower yields with things like cover crops in the northern sites. So, a couple of insights here. Soil type, as we've mentioned, but specifically this distinction of the prairie soils that are higher in OM versus the timber soils that are lower in organic matter. This seems to be the major first divider of site responsiveness or lack thereof. Again, the explanation here is that there's a lot of scientific data out there that if you start with higher organic matter content, you just have less benefits to gaining the same amount. Proportionally speaking, gaining X amount of carbon from, say, cover cropping will matter more in a lower start point OM soil like what we have down south. So these results that we're seeing, I think, make sense. One key takeaway to consider here is that it may not make sense to pay these relatively high costs of soil health tests in the early stages of adoption. And this is a value of this work, and it's one of the intents, which is in that initial 0 to 4 year period, we're at the halfway mark here, do we begin to see changes? And the answer is a robust no. We do not see a change in soil health tests, not just respiration, but any of the other ones to tillage or cover cropping practices. We do see, of course, a rotation effect down south. So double cropping wheat with soybean does seem to be altering soil respiration. Specifically, it makes it higher. And this, I think, gets at some of the value of wheat as a conservation crop rotation. We know that there are erosional benefits, nutrient loss benefits to wheat. In some sense, it's a cover crop that pays. And when it comes to soil health, this project is giving evidence that there are soil health benefits that we might imagine from having roots in the ground for more time. So specifically, we are seeing up to 40% higher respiration with the double cropping in the following corn phase. So it's not simply a short-lived effect. It seems like a longer 1 year extension effect of double cropping wheat. Again, this is seen as a trend across sites, but only significant down south statistically, likely because of just 2 years in. So this is good evidence that wheat can do good things for us. The third insight here is that we find that the values of the respiration tests vary more by when we sample in the low OM soils. So down south on these timber soils, there should be a lot of care taken because the respiration value that you get back will matter or be more influenced by when you take it than by the practice if these are early stage practice changes, i.e. 2 years. So good to standardize the sampling and compare values within the same time, fall versus springtime. So I'd like to end on a few questions that were sent in that Kelsey had mentioned in the time that we have left. So we had a few questions that get at this idea of returns and about duration. And a fourth insight could be here, as we've heard from Heidi as well, that tillage had a bigger impact overall on net ROI in the first 2 years compared to cover cropping. We see no effect of those same practices on soil health. And this is consistent with there's typically more benefits to yield, to soil health, and then as we are seeing here, to profitability and lower organic matter soils. And those are lesser, even negative returns to profitability in higher OM soils in the short term. That's the key caveat because this is likely to change. We have evidence that there's a break point somewhere down the line. Whether that's in 3 years or in 10 years is to be determined. So one question that was put in is how long do we plan to keep these trials running? Well, if ISA is willing, we would love to keep these going as benchmark sites. And I would argue that in the coming 3, 4, 6, 7 years, we can have these breakthrough points quantifiable by soil types for the soil health, yield, and profitability outcomes of these conservation practices by rotation types. And this was a good example of the value of that approach that this other question that was submitted got at, which is how long before we see the benefits from the cover crop? I want to be really clear, even though we don't see benefits of cover cropping in 2 years for soil health, and we see negative net returns to profitability from these cover crops in the first 2 years, that is not to say that we do not expect net benefits some point down the road. And that's oftentimes a pain point of transition to cover cropping. There's, of course, lots of ways to play with this. The species, we've been talking about cereal rye at a given seeding rate. If we think about interseeding or say skip row seeding with strip tillage, if we think about legumes or winter kill options, there are a lot of other ways to use the tool of cover cropping. So let's be clear, we're looking at 2 years of cereal rye. There's a large plurality of methods and many success stories of having short-term positive ROIs to cover crops. And one example that we'd like to pursue more for our research on this, in collaboration with ISA and with farmers, is getting tangible. This gets at my earlier theme of can we calibrate soil health tests to clear outcomes on units of NPK saved? And this question, I think, gets at that, which is can we reduce our applications of P and K after X years of cover cropping? That is a great question, and I've yet to see any field data on it. And so to support that, what we'd like to do to support these two themes of soil health and cover cropping, to get at questions like this, I want to propose that we can come to you in the coming extension season of this winter for in-person soil health discussion groups. We just kicked off the first one in Warren County last Thursday. Myself and others come up to the county. It can be hosted at someone's shop in the county farm bureau office, and we have a 2-hour brainstorming session. What we want to understand is how folks are thinking about soil health, their misgivings, their interests, their suggestions on soil health interpretation, how to develop on-farm trials that provide the kind of data that people want to be able to use soil health for economic benefits for cropping systems. And also, my own interest here is we want to develop new soil health tests. They could be based on earthworms. They could be based on a combination of CO2 with other matrices. But this, I think, is where we need to go as a state to make soil health more economically viable. And if you have interest, please let me know. Again, we are coming out to counties and putting on these quick brainstorming talks for 2 hours. In the same vein, if there's interest in the question on cover cropping for nutrient benefits, this has been asked a couple of times in terms of P and K, in terms of N fixation and the release. Likewise, we are looking for folks to host on-farm P and K trials. P or K. We do all the work of the prescription maps, the soil sampling, working with the applicator, looking at the yield data, providing several thousands of dollars worth of nutrient fertility tests, but also soil health tests. We're looking at every single soil health test offered by NRCS in these assessments for 64 soils per field trial. The grower gets all the data back at no cost, and this helps us understand whether there are benefits of cover cropping for P and K application or savings. So with that, we want to thank you for your time, and I believe there's some closing remarks by Kelsey.
Yes. We have two quick questions. One, someone asked, what rate of cereal rye is being used and what specifically are you using for 2 times tillage? Majority of pre-soybean tillage here in northeastern Illinois is one vertical tillage pass in the fall and none in the spring.
Great question. So for the cover cropping, we're using a range from 40 to 60 pounds of cereal rye per acre. Depends on the site, on what local folks recommend. And then for the chisel tillage treatment, we're doing a fall chisel. Um, and that includes after soybean, which I know doesn't make agronomic sense, but we're trying to amplify the differences. And that is a fair critique of our treatments that you could probably skip chiseling soybean stubble, but we are doing it. And then we've got spring disc and harrowing. In some sites, we have a lighter chisel in the spring as well. Depends on how blocky the clods are that are left over from the fall chisel pass. So
Andrew,
what tillage
ju-
looks like does vary for the chisel treatment across those different sites.
sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add a little bit more detail to your answer. Is in North and East Central Illinois, we're doing chisel plowing in the fall and a cultivator pass in the spring. And we in the South, we're only using a tandem disc for both passes. And for exact rates of cover crops, we have, excuse my measurements in kilograms per hectare, but that is what I have in hand for Monmouth, 67 kilograms per hectare, 50 at Urbana, and 48 at Ewing.
Thank you. Andrew, if you want to go ahead and stop sharing your screen, I'll have Lauren pull up the QR code for the CCA credit as I share this last question we have. Someone asked, so are you using a conventional fertility program on all studies?
Yes, we are. So we use soil testing, Melic P, Melic K, buffer pH and pH to inform PK and lime rates. And for nitrogen for corn, we use the MRTN for all the sites with spring application.
Okay. Well, that's all the questions I see. I know we're on, our hour is up, and there's still a lot to talk about. So, as I said earlier, Andrew and Heidi tried to answer as many questions as they could with the time that they had today. But as Dr. Margenot said earlier, he is interested in having more conversations across the state of Illinois. So I hope you take him up on that opportunity as well. So I'll go ahead and start to end this webinar, but we have a couple more. Uh, Let me pull up my outline here. A couple more things to just mention. So I want to thank Andrew and Heidi for presenting today. We will keep you all posted about another webinar here in the next couple of months as well. So thank you for presenting and thank you all for attending as well. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules, as I said before. So go ahead if you haven't yet, scan that QR code if you are watching live. If you are watching this recording, we recommend self-reporting. And if you need assistance with that, you can email us at fieldadvisor@ilsoy.org. We'll also have more information about self-reporting and the survey to help you do that as well. And then, Lauren, if you want to move on to the next slide, I do want to mention as well, registration's open for our December webinar with Dr. Tranel at the University of Illinois. In this webinar, he will also highlight Illinois soybean checkoff funded research and talk about the status of herbicide resistance in water hemp across the state and what research is being done to help farmers identify resistance problems sooner and preserve effective herbicide options for the future. So if you go onto Field Advisor or scan that QR code, we'll have all that information posted as well and all of our social media channels too. Andrew, Heidi, is there anything else you want to mention before we log off here?
Just that we'd love to hear from producers and crop consultants about soil health testing. One of our goals in the coming years is to try to introduce that kind of rigor by calibrating to outcomes of interest and even thinking about developing soil health tests from scratch. So if you want us to come out to your county and talk, let us know. We're happy to do so.
Great. Heidi, anything else?
That would be
Okay.
it. Thank you for being here.
Well, it's lunchtime for those who are watching live. So again, we appreciate you hopping on today. We'll have the recording here available very soon. And one more thank you to Andrew and Heidi as well. We hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, Kelsey. Take care.
Thank you.